12 aircraft, no guns, no armor, no combat markings, just silence. And somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, a man checked in under a fake name, boarded a flying hotel, and crossed a war zone as if the war did not exist. That man was the President of the United States, and the aircraft that carried him was hiding in plain sight. The whole time, what was it? And why did the entire world forget it existed? Welcome to WW2 Ghost Wings, where history's forgotten machines finally get to speak. Now, before we go any further, if you are watching this right now, do something for us. Hit that subscribe button. Think of it like locking your front door before you go to sleep. You have done it so many times. You almost do it without thinking. But the one night you forget, that is the night it matters. Don't forget tonight, subscribe, so you never miss a story like this one. And while you are at it, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world are you watching from. Whether you are sitting in London, Lagos, Lahore, or Los Angeles, we want to know. Every single one of you. In 1936, the world did not yet know what was coming. The trenches of the First World War were still fresh in the memory of older men. Governments were still negotiating. Diplomats were still talking. And somewhere in Seattle, Washington, a group of Boeing engineers were staring at a design brief that had nothing to do with war. Pan American Airways had asked them to build something extraordinary. It's not a bomber, not a fighter, a passenger aircraft. One that could carry wealthy travelers across the Atlantic Ocean, in comfort, in style, and without stopping. The brief was ambitious almost to the point of arrogance. The aircraft needed to fly approximately 2,400 miles against a 30-mile-per-hour headwind. It needed to take off from rough ocean water. It needed to carry passengers who expected fine china, white-gloved stewards, and a dining salon where proper meals were served at proper tables. Boeing accepted the challenge. What they produced was the Model 314, and the moment it left the drawing board, it was unlike anything the aviation world had ever seen. The numbers told part of the story. It's a wingspan of 152 feet. A hull stretching 106 feet from nose to tail. An empty weight of 48,000 pounds that climbed past 82,000 pounds. When fully loaded for a transoceanic crossing. For Wright double cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,500 horsepower. Combining for a total output of 6,000 horsepower. But the numbers did not tell the whole story. What made the Boeing 314 truly extraordinary was not its size. It was what that size enabled. Engineers built a crawl space inside the wing itself, accessible during flight, so mechanics could physically inspect and service the engines while the aircraft was airborne over open ocean, on a crossing that could last more than 20 hours. That crawl space was not a luxury. It was survival. 10 American named these aircraft Clippers, and they gave each one a name of its own. The Yankee Clipper, the Dixie Clipper, the Pacific Clipper, the Atlantic Clipper. 12 aircraft in total. Only 12 were ever built. In 1939, they began crossing the Atlantic carrying wealthy passengers, who paid the equivalent of $8,000 for a round-trip ticket. Nobody called them weapons. Nobody imagined they would become the most consequential transport aircraft of the entire Second World War. But history rarely announces itself in advance. There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not wear a uniform. It does not carry a weapon. It does not appear in the official records of military procurement or combat deployment. It simply moves. And in moving, it changes everything. By December 1941, the United States was at war. Pearl Harbor had shattered whatever remained of American neutrality. Within hours of the attack, military planners in Washington were already making calculations. Shipping lanes were vulnerable. Conventional military transports required runways. Runways required infrastructure. Infrastructure required time. Time was the one thing nobody had. And then someone looked at the 12 Boeing 314 Clippers still operating under Pan American colors and understood something that the enemy never did. These aircraft did not need runways. They needed water, and water was everywhere. Any calm harbor, any protected bay, any sheltered stretch of coastline anywhere on Earth could become an operational base within hours. The Boeing 314 carried its own runway with it every time it touched down. The United States Army Air Forces and the United States Navy moved quickly. An agreement was reached with Pan American Airways. The Clippers would continue flying under civilian registration, with Pan American crews still at the controls. But the missions they flew would now serve an entirely different purpose. This was the first layer of the strategy. Keep the aircraft looking civilian. Keep the markings familiar. Keep the routes appearing routine. Because an aircraft that looks like a passenger transport attracts a fundamentally different kind of attention than one painted in military colors. The Boeing 314 became something that military strategists rarely achieve and almost never sustain. A weapon that did not look like one. The missions began quietly. Diplomatic pouches containing documents too sensitive for radio transmission moved across oceans aboard clippers that appeared to be carrying ordinary cargo. Senior military officers crossed between theaters of operation on aircraft that resembled peacetime luxury transports. Intelligence personnel, technical experts, scientists working on projects whose names would not become public for decades. All of them moved through a global network that officially barely existed. The British Overseas Airways Corporation, which had purchased 3 of the improved 314A models before the war began, understood the same logic. Their aircraft were repainted in dark sea, gray, and camouflage green on the upper surfaces, sky blue underneath, designed to disappear against the ocean when viewed from above by enemy patrol aircraft. Invisibility, engineered deliberately, reach that no other aircraft on Earth could match. A payload of consequences. Dressed in the clothing of commerce. The enemy was watching the skies for fighters and bombers. Nobody was watching for a flying hotel. Most people, when they think about winning a war, think about weapons. They think about tanks rolling across borders, bombers darkening the sky, soldiers moving through jungle and desert and snow. They rarely think about fuel. They rarely think about a mechanic, balanced on a small wooden launch, bobbing in a harbor at 3 in the morning, somewhere on the west coast of Africa, tightening a bolt on the hull of an aircraft that officially was not supposed to be there. But that mechanic, in that harbor, at that hour, was as responsible for Allied victory as any pilot who ever pulled a trigger. Because the Boeing 314 did not operate on courage alone. It operated on a system. And that system is one of the most sophisticated, most invisible, and most deliberately forgotten logistical empires ever assembled in the history of modern warfare. Pan American Airways had spent years before the war building what it called its marine terminal network. Purpose-built facilities at Baltimore, Port Washington, Bermuda, Horta in the Azores, Foynes in Ireland, Wood in Newfoundland. Each terminal was engineered specifically for flying boat operations, fuel storage, mooring equipment. Marine crews trained to handle aircraft the size of small ships, with their stations feeding data to navigators planning routes across featureless ocean. This infrastructure did not happen overnight. It was the product of years of quiet, expensive, methodical investment that Pan American had made long before anyone imagined it would one day serve a military purpose. When the war arrived, that civilian infrastructure became a military asset overnight. But the war also pushed the network far beyond its original boundaries. New fuel stops were established at locations that appeared on almost no commercial maps. Remote harbors in West Africa, sheltered bays in South America, protected anchorages across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Hasty installations built by military engineering crews who understood only that an aircraft of enormous strategic importance needed to land, refuel, and disappear again before dawn. Mechanics traveled with the aircraft, not in comfort, but in the same crew quarters that had once housed Pan American's relief pilots on peacetime luxury routes. These men carried specialized tools, spare parts, and the particular kind of knowledge that cannot be written in any manual, the knowledge of how to keep a specific machine alive, under conditions that machine was never designed to face. The Boeing 314 was engineered with one feature that now proved its true worth in ways its designers had never anticipated: a crawl space built inside the wing itself, accessible during flight, allowing engineers to physically reach the engines while the aircraft was airborne over open ocean, on a mission lasting 20 hours, crossing waters patrolled by enemy submarines and aircraft. The ability to detect an oil leak, tighten a failing seal, or identify an overheating cylinder before it became a catastrophe was not engineering elegance. It was the difference between arrival and disappearance. One aircraft on one mission demonstrated this with almost painful clarity. During President Roosevelt's crossing to Casablanca in January 1943, the Dixie Clipper developed an oil leak serious enough to require diversion. The crew identified it, managed it, rose it calmly, repaired it without incident. Roosevelt, reportedly, slept through the entire episode. That was the system working exactly as intended. Not dramatic, not heroic in any visible sense, just precise, quiet, ruthlessly competent. The greatest logistical achievements in history share one defining characteristic: they are invisible. Until they stop working, the system behind the Boeing 314 never stopped working. And because it never stopped working, nobody ever had to notice it at all. There is a moment in the life of every dominant asset, every dominant system, every dominant idea, when the world it was built for simply stops needing it. That moment rarely arrives with fanfare. It does not announce itself with headlines or ceremonies. There is no official declaration, no formal acknowledgement that something extraordinary is quietly becoming unnecessary. It arrives the way most endings arrive, gradually, then suddenly, then completely, for the Boeing 314 Clipper. That moment began somewhere around 1944. Not because the aircraft had failed, not because the missions had stopped mattering, not because the crews had lost their extraordinary competence or the system behind them had collapsed. It began because, somewhere on a runway in a field that had not existed 3 years earlier, a land-based aircraft lifted off, crossed an ocean, and landed again, without needing water, without needing marine terminals, without needing boat crews, without needing the elaborate, expensive, irreplaceable infrastructure that the Boeing 314 carried as both its greatest strength, and its most quietly dangerous vulnerability. The consolidated C-87 Liberator Express arrived first, derived from the B-24 bomber. It was not comfortable. It was not elegant. It offered none of the range flexibility that made the Clipper so strategically valuable in the early war years. But it was improving. Then came the Douglas C-54 Skymaster, and the calculation changed permanently. The C-54 could operate from any runway that Allied engineers had carved out of any terrain on Earth, and by 1944, Allied engineers had carved runways out of almost every terrain on Earth. Jungle clearings in the Pacific, desert strips in North Africa, frozen ground in Iceland, hastily paved surfaces in India, Burma, Brazil, and 100 locations in between. Every new runway was a quiet argument against the flying boat. Every successful C-54 crossing was a data point accumulating against the Clipper's continued relevance. The men who flew the Boeing 314 during the war understood what was happening, even as they were living inside it. Veteran Pan American crews spoke privately about a sense that the world they represented was receding beneath them. Even as they flew, they were right. The economics were shifting in ways that no amount of operational brilliance could reverse. Land-based aircraft did not require harbors. They did not require marine infrastructure. They did not require the specialized knowledge, the trained boat crews, the carefully positioned fuel networks that the Clipper demanded at every stop on every route across every ocean. The Boeing 314's greatest advantage had always been that it carried its runway with it. But runways were no longer scarce, and an advantage built on scarcity has no defense against abundance. By 1945, Pan American had already taken delivery of Douglas DC for aircraft. Planning had begun for a new generation of long-range transports that would operate entirely from conventional airports. The marine terminals that had served the Clippers, Baltimore, Port Washington, Botwood, Foynes, began their quiet descent into irrelevance. The 12 Boeing 314 Clippers were sold off. Some 2 smaller operators who believed, briefly, that a commercial future still existed for flying boats of this scale. Those operators discovered quickly what Pan American had already calculated. The maintenance costs were unsustainable. The operational requirements were too specialized. The world had already decided what air travel would look like going forward: faster, cheaper, higher, more democratic, less magnificent. One by one, the surviving aircraft were scrapped, their enormous hulls broken apart for aluminum recycling, the metal that had once carried presidents, diplomats, intelligence officers, and the quiet decisions of a global war, melted down and repurposed for a world that had already moved on. Not a single complete Boeing 314 survives today. 12 aircraft, 7 years of service, an ocean of consequence. And then, nothing. Because in the end, it's the most important lesson the Boeing 314 Clipper left behind. It's not about aviation. It was not about war. It was not even about the extraordinary men and women who built it, flew it, and maintained it across the most dangerous years in modern history. It was about something far more uncomfortable, something that every strategist, every business leader, every decision-maker who has ever built something genuinely dominant eventually has to face.